All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us on this Tuesday morning. My name is Victoria Bergeron, and I'm joined today by Megan Callahan, who is our research director at the Mass Taxpayers Foundation. And we are excited to be able to go through some details of the House Ways and Means budget proposal for FY 2026 with you today, and especially what that means for early education and care programs for the state. Before we get started with the slides, we wanted to try something new today that we haven't done before in these presentations, but we wanted to try to do a poll just so we can get a sense internally of who's here and kind of what your role is, what your interest is in the state budget in early education. If you come to one of our earlier presentations this year, just good for us to know before we get started so that we can kind of anticipate any questions potentially that could come up. So feel free to take a second and answer our 3 questions in the poll. We'll just give it a minute and then we will get started with our slides. So again, thank you all for coming. We are recording and we will be sharing the slides and the recording of the presentation afterwards. So if anyone was not able to join today that you know of, feel free to let them know that they will be able to access all this information, and hopefully that'll be helpful, especially I know a lot of educators themselves can't join at 10 a.m. on a Tuesday. So hopefully that is helpful. All right. I think I'll give it 30 more seconds. I know people are still joining, but this will just help us internally here. All right, great. I'm going to end the poll. And if you would like to see the results, feel free. But again, this is more for an internal check from Megan and I before we start. So a good amount of folks in the field here today. Thank you so much for coming, and other stakeholders and advocates as well. And a good amount also came to our presentation in February on the governor's budget. So that's great. Thank you for coming back. And if this is your first MTF presentation, we hope it's helpful for you. All right, I'm going to now share my screen and we will get started. And just want to make sure, Megan, is that the full screen slides?
Not quite yet.
Not yet. Okay, let's see. Let me change this. We had practiced, but okay, good now?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, so again, thank you everybody for joining. My name is Victoria Bergeron, and Megan and I will be going through the House Ways and Means budget and what it means for early education and care. First, just going to give a quick overview of the state budget process, some key terms, a timeline of where we're at now, and then Megan will do an update of the state fiscal picture. We'll touch a bit on a supplemental budget that will also be debated in the Senate as well coming up, and then get through some big picture stats on the House Ways and Means budget before getting into specifics on the early education proposals. So just a quick overview. I know there might be some new folks on here of some frequently used terms that you might hear in this presentation or in general as you're learning about the state budget. So the state budget operates on a fiscal year schedule from July 1st to June 1st. And right now what we'll be mostly talking about is the fiscal year FY 2026 budget, which will start on this coming July 1st, 2025. Section 2 of the state budget is where most of what we'll talk about lives. It's where you'll find direct appropriations for programs that are organized by state department. And line items are kind of each unique account for each program that's funded in the state budget. And also, again, they're organized by the department that they fall under. So The EEC line items, most of them fall under the same bucket and start with the number 3,000. So that's like an easy thing to remember there. Earmarks are pieces of language that are included within line items to fund specific programs or specific local priorities often. And then appropriation is just what we call that total funding amount for a line item. The GAA, you'll probably hear us say a few times, stands for General Appropriations Act, which is the final budget once it's signed into law every year. So if you hear FY 2025 GAA, that's the final budget that was signed last year that is now in effect in this current fiscal year. And then finally, outside sections are pieces of the state budget that deal with more broad policy often. Sometimes they're related to specific budget appropriations, but they could also just be amending other laws or policy for in the state general law. So last year you might have heard there was a lot of early education policy that was passed through outside sections in the state budget. So that's always something that we track as well. This is just a quick example of a line item, so showing you that this line item has an earmark that says that $100,000 out of the total appropriation will be dedicated to a specific program. So we'll definitely be talking about a couple key earmarks later on, and it's just a good example for the pieces to look for when you are reading through a very long document. So right now we were kind of in the middle of the state budget process. So the governor released her budget proposal for FY 2026 in January. The House Ways and Means Committee released their budget proposal last week. And then the representatives are able to file amendments related to the Ways and Means budget before they go into budget debate, which will start a week from yesterday, I guess. And then we'll be the next step in the process. We'll move to the Senate, and they follow a mirrored system as well there. So just a key step here, we wanted to highlight the amendment process. So for the 3 days after the Ways and Means Committees put out their budgets, the representatives file amendments to that budget. So they could be to increase line item funding amounts, to add in those local earmarks that we talked about often. They are reflective of conversations that reps have with advocates or constituents. And this year we might have hit a record. We saw 1,650 amendments filed to the House Ways and Means budget. So we will be putting out also a kind of summary primer of all these amendments later this week, I believe. So if you really want to dig deep, there's a lot to dig into. But that's kind of a key step that we just went through, and then next week is when debate will happen. So the amendments will all be consolidated into kind of these big amendment packages and then voted on during debate. And the chart on the right here kind of shows you the level of funding that could be added on the debate floor to the House Ways and Means budget. Also, in addition to funding amounts, we often see other policy proposals included during debate. So that's something to watch as well. And I'll turn it over to Megan for some state fiscal update.
Great. Thank you. So as Victoria mentioned, we're going to spend most of the rest of the presentation talking about the budget development process for fiscal year 2026. But we also find it really helpful to start off these presentations with kind of an update on where things stand in our current fiscal year, so FY 2025. Understanding how revenues have come in to date for this fiscal year can really help us understand what the rest of the FY 26 budget development is going to look like. So through March, state tax revenue collections in FY 25 total just under $30 billion. And really, there are a couple of positive signs here, although they do have a couple caveats, which I'll get into as well. So to date, collections are about $2 billion ahead of where we were at this time last year in FY 2024. And we're about 3% ahead of benchmark, or 786 million ahead of where we would have otherwise expected to be. Both of those are very positive signs. However, it's important to point out that the strongest revenue growth that we've seen has been in the non-withheld income tax category. And a lot of that is driven by capital gains tax collections, as well as revenues related to the surtax or the fair share tax. We point that out because each of those two types of revenue are kind of held separate from what the resources are that are available to support general budgeted spending. And so when we talk about revenue collections to date, it's important for us to kind of call those out because it's not going to translate directly into what we might think of as a budget surplus. That being said, we have a slide in just a little bit in which I'll walk through how if revenues meet expectations for the final 3 months of the fiscal year, April, May, and June, it does appear that at the close of FY25, total revenue collections will be ahead of expectations. But again, we're going to need to take into account a couple of considerations, including the types of tax revenue that have been collected, as well as other things like supplemental budget spending and other considerations before we understand what amount of resources are actually available to support general budgeted spending. And the other thing that we'll talk a little bit about later in the presentation is that while we've seen some positive signs to date in terms of tax revenue collections in FY25, there is still a high degree of uncertainty related to what the state impacts will be based on some actions that take place at the federal level. So we'll get into kind of the federal budget process and how that might impact the state, as well as just some other considerations that we think are important for policymakers and stakeholders to keep in mind as we continue to assess kind of what's happening at the federal level. With this chart, this is a familiar one we've included in other presentations, but here we're showing what those revenue collections to date look like, both compared to last year. So those are the yellow bars. You can see we're just about $2 billion ahead of where we were last year. And then the blue bars are where actual revenue collections compare to benchmark. So ahead on both fronts. Again, both of these are positive signs. You can go to the next slide, Victoria. And then when we kind of look under the hood at where those revenue collections are coming in, I think in this table, if you look at the non-withheld income tax category, which is the highlighted row of this table, here's where you can see that revenues in that tax category are growing over benchmark by 35%, so at a much higher rate than every other type of tax that the state collects. And again, this is important to point out because these are really driven by those capital gains tax collections, and a lot of the money that the state collects through the fair share tax comes in through the non-withheld income tax category. And both of those revenue types need to be set aside from kind of what's available to support general budgeted spending. In the case of capital gains tax collections, an amount over a certain threshold that the state collects gets automatically deposited into the state stabilization fund, whereas fair share revenues or surtax revenues, as we all know, get held aside in the education and transportation fund, only available to support education and transportation spending. The next slide. And so this is that chart that I mentioned earlier, where if we look at fiscal year 25 revenue collections to date, that's just under 30 billion. And then we assume that revenue collections in April, May, and June at least meet expectations, then you can see that we end up with total collections above the total year-end benchmark, that increase of about $785 million. That number, though, doesn't translate directly to what's going to be a budget surplus, because we're also going to need to take into account surtax revenue collections, supplemental spending, other non-tax revenue collection factors, as well as planned saving initiatives. All of those factors kind of get considered together as the administration is looking to how we can close the books and balance at the end of the fiscal year. So this is a helpful number to keep in mind, but just remember that this doesn't translate directly to what's going to be available to support additional spending at the end of the fiscal year. And then I'm turning it back to Victoria to talk about another update related to the supplemental budget that the House passed the week before the House Ways and Means budget was released.
Thanks, Megan. So this year is extra fun because we are tracking two budgets that are moving through the legislature. So as Megan said, the week before, House Ways and Means released their proposal for FY 2026, the House voted on their version of what we're calling an Innovation and Capital Fund supplemental budget, which is intended to allocate the funds that have been held from the fair share revenue that has come in as a surplus in the past 2 fiscal years, and put those funds toward additional investments in education and transportation. So there is about $1.3 billion held in the Innovation and Capital Fund account that is a surplus fair share revenue that was not previously allocated. So that's what is in this supplemental budget. And we wanted to talk about it here because we kind of view these two budget vehicles together, in that a lot of the spending proposed in the supplemental budget is intended to complement the proposals that we're talking about in the FY 2026 operating budget. So in both the governor and the House versions of the supplemental budget, we've seen investments to support both one-time capital related costs, especially related to the transportation sector, but also a lot of ongoing operating costs for programs that in the education and transportation areas. So we're kind of keeping track of both of these budgets as they move through the process. And together we can see that between the operating budget proposals for FY 2026 and the supplemental budget, the fair share funds are split pretty evenly between the education and transportation sectors, which is something that we've been advocating for at MTF as intended in when fair share was passed. But also we want to highlight that we're looking at the budgets together, because the intentions behind the supplemental budget are more towards the one-time capital in nature. And that's why we see transportation being supported more heavily in the supplemental budget, versus education receives a higher share in the operating budget. But if we put both budgets together, we see a 50-50 division between the sectors. For early education in the supplemental budget, this chart just shows a comparison between the governor's proposal and the House version. And you can see that they're tackling early education a little bit differently. So the governor included $50 million for an expansion to the Commonwealth Preschool Partnership Initiative in her supplemental budget. And also a $100 million line item that is pretty broad for workforce affordability and quality improvement initiatives. So in total, in the governor's supplemental budget, she included $150 million for early education. The House version did not include funding for CPPI expansion in their supplemental budget, and the overall amount that they allocated for the workforce affordability and quality improvement section was brought down to $55.5 million. Within that, they also included some specific earmarks out of that 55.5. So $20 million would be set aside to support a reimbursement rate increase for CCFA providers in FY 2026. $7.5 million would be set aside to continue funding for an early educator loan forgiveness program that was passed in last year's budget. And then $8 million would also be set aside through an earmark to support the early educator personal child care. So allowing educators themselves to receive CCFA to support their own child care there. So we'll touch on a few of these things later on, but just gives you an overview of the different proposals included in the supplemental budget for early education. We're probably expecting the Senate to follow a similar schedule that the House did, acting on their supplemental budget around the same time as they work on their FY 2026 proposals. And back to Megan.
So just to talk kind of high level about revenue and spending that we see in the House Ways and Means budget before handing it back to Victoria to talk specifically about early ed. To call out some of the major themes that we see in the House Ways and Means budget. The first thing that we've been pointing out and that we think is particularly notable is that the House Ways and Means budget for FY 26 does include about $580 million less in spending than the governor's proposal. Compared to the FY 25 GAA, spending grows by just under $4 billion or 6.4%. And some of the more notable reductions that we see in the House's proposal versus what was in the governor's proposal are related to mass health, local aid for cities and towns through a program called UGA, or Unrestricted General Government Aid, as well as a reduced funding level for the Emergency Assistance Shelter System. The other thing we've been flagging is that the House Ways and Means budget, despite some of the uncertainties that we're still kind of dealing with from the federal level or broader economic trends, we don't see an adjustment to the revenue benchmark for fiscal year 2026. So there were no underlying changes made to how much state tax revenue collections are anticipated to come in the next fiscal year reflected in the House Ways and Means budget. In addition to that, on the revenue side, the House's spending bill doesn't include any new tax revenue generating initiatives. In the governor's budget, we had seen about a dozen tax policy changes that they had anticipated providing about just under $400 million in new revenue to help support spending in the upcoming fiscal year. We don't see any of those reflected in the House Ways and Means budget. As Victoria just mentioned, and we'll continue to talk through in the slides that follow, when we consider surtax spending in the operating budget alongside the supplemental surtax spending bill, those resources are divided evenly between education and transportation. And then lastly, while there is one policy proposal related to early ed, which Victoria will get into, on the whole, the House Ways and Means budget is generally pretty light on outside policy sections. They have 80 sections total in their committee budget compared to the 138 that we saw come out of the administration's proposal. And so then to get into some of those revenue and resources top lines. So as I mentioned, the House Ways and Means budget does not adjust the FY26 consensus revenue estimate, and that's the non-surtax revenue figure of $41.2 billion. At $41.2 billion, that's about 2.2% growth over our current fiscal year, or about $900 million in increased revenue compared to this year. That might sound like a lot, as I'll get into on the next slide. It doesn't really translate to that much new base tax revenue available to support spending. But the other thing that we like to point out here is that while we do anticipate year over year revenues to grow, at least right now, FY26 is the first time that we would see tax revenues exceed the level that was collected in fiscal year 2022, which was kind of that high watermark as we came out of the pandemic. So really, I know this is something we talked about when we reviewed the governor's budget as well, but over the last 4 fiscal years or so, very, very limited tax revenue growth. And policymakers have basically been building their proposals with almost no new tax revenue since fiscal year 2022. And so here's where we walk through, if you look at that $41.2 billion total consensus revenue figure for FY26, once we take into account a number of pre-budget transfers, so the automatic transfers of certain types of revenue towards things like the School Building Authority or the MBTA or the state's pension fund, once we take into account all of those things that happen automatically, what we're left with are consensus taxes remaining for budgeted spending of about $32.9 billion. That's the same level available that was in the governor's budget. And that's really only $144 million more in new tax revenue, base tax revenue, than was available when they were building the FY 2025 budget. So that's a real challenge. We'll talk about the spending growth that we see in the House budget and how it compares to the governor's budget. But it's billions of dollars in spending growth for the state that really needed to be managed within this very limited amount of new tax revenue growth. And so that's why we saw in the governor's budget and why we see in the House Ways and Means budget as well, a number of revenue generating initiatives relied upon to help support additional spending. You can go to the next slide. Policymakers also, in addition to those revenue generating initiatives, do have access to more surtax revenue this year to support spending than they have in the prior 2 years. So in the FY26 budget, the governor, the House, and the Senate have all agreed that the surtax spending cap for FY26 is going to be set at $1.95 billion. That's a 50% increase, or about $650 million more than was available last year in FY25. It's a nearly $1 billion increase than what they had available in FY24 when that initial surtax spending cap was set at only $1 billion. So this does provide obviously a lot of new revenue to support specifically education and transportation spending. And then in terms of the revenue generating initiatives that we see included, so in total, there's about $1.5 billion in revenue solutions used in the House Ways and Means budget. That's slightly less, about $400 million less than what we saw in the governor's budget. And really the entirety of that difference is related to the House not adopting any of the tax policy changes that the administration put forth. Other than that, we see a lot of the same solutions relied upon, things like the recoupment of certain COVID era grants that have not been obligated yet. There's a proposal related to the redistribution of certain gaming fund revenues, now making those resources available to support kind of general budgeted spending. And then we see a number of other trust initiatives or departmental initiatives, including on the trust fund. We see them going back to the Early Education and Care Operational Grant Trust Fund to support spending, as well as the High Quality and Affordability Early Education and Care Trust Fund as well. And then the other thing we like to point out is that of that $1.5 billion in revenue solutions that we see in the House budget, about 1.3 billion of them, by our estimate, are just one-time in nature. So they'll be available to support spending in FY26. They'll no longer be available in FY27. And the reason why we point that out, what's available this year and what's not going to be there on an ongoing basis, is because this directly translates to kind of the structural balance of the budget. And in fact, we see that the use of one-time resources grows over this year's budget, FY25, by about 1/3. And so we can think about that as increasing the budget's structural deficit by about 1/3 as well. Next year, when we start talking about the FY27 budget development process, one of the first decisions that policymakers are going to have to make, or first things they're going to have to confront, is how we make up about $1.3 billion in revenue from the resources that were used this year, no longer available next year. All right, so moving on to kind of big picture spending themes. A couple key questions I will point out, a number of which we'll get into in greater detail as we move through the slides. So I talked about spending growth versus the FY25 GAA. So in the House budget, that looks like about 6.4%, and that's 1 percentage point lower than the spending growth that we saw in Governor Healey's budget, which was 7.4%. Again, the difference there is that the House is spending just under $600 million less than the spending level we saw in the administration's proposal. Surtax supported spending, when assessed holistically, as we've talked about, divided evenly 50-50 between education and transportation. And then in terms of key program commitments, we're obviously going to talk about the continuation of the C3 Stabilization Grant Program at $475 million later in the presentation. But just across the budget, a couple other things that might be worth flagging for folks. The House Ways and Means budget continues to implement the Student Opportunity Act, so it fully funds the 5th year of a 6-year implementation schedule. The SOA is the Student Opportunity Act. So that's the K-12 Education Finance Reform Bill that was passed in 2019. We've been on a 6-year implementation schedule to fully phase in that bill. So we're in the 5th of the 6th year of that schedule. And then in addition to C3, I think a big priority that jumps out in the House Ways and Means budget is that it reflects a number of key elements of the governor's larger transportation finance strategy. So it includes a substantial amount of funding for the MBTA, but also supplemental funding for MassDOT and RTAs, and really checks off a couple of those key pillars of really stabilizing the transportation system. One of the things that we talked a lot about after the governor's budget was released, but remains true when we talk about the House Ways and Means budget as well, is the impact of non-discretionary program cost increases on overall state budget spending trends. When we talk about non-discretionary programs, these include things like Mass Health, or the Group Insurance Commission, or Chapter 70 state aid for local cities and towns. It also includes like DCF, DTA childcare, entitlements that the state is obligated to cover the costs of those programs, even as they increase kind of exponentially. In the House budget, we see non-discretionary program cost growth accounting for $2.8 billion of the overall increase of $3.7 billion. And so the cost of those programs are growing at a rate of about 7.6% compared to more discretionary programs, which are growing at a rate of 4.4%. So we like to call out this difference for a couple of different reasons, but primarily because one of the things that we spend a lot of time talking about and looking at kind of longer term state budget spending trends is the importance of spending growth and revenue growth over the long term to align. And generally what that means is keeping both spending and revenue growth assumptions within the 3 to 4% range. We've seen now in both the governor's budget and the House Ways and Means budget, spending growing at a much higher rate than that. But we also think it's important to acknowledge that a lot of that spending growth is being driven by these programs that are non-discretionary and that the state is obligated to cover. And just to kind of put a finer point on that, here we call out the 20 programs in the House Ways and Means budget that grow by the largest nominal difference compared to the FY25 GAA. And the programs that are highlighted in yellow are those non-discretionary programs, and they make up about half of the programs listed in this top 20 list. Across these programs, they account for 60% of all spending in the House Ways and Means budget. And within that 60%, the non-discretionary programs account for a very large fraction as well. So again, just to the point that I was making earlier, we think it's helpful to include this context because while we'll talk about the importance of kind of reining in spending growth over time to make sure that the budget on the long term is sustainable, we also acknowledge that a lot of these costs are kind of outside of our control, and we're obligated to cover them.
All right, so I'm going to be getting into the early education investments that are proposed in the House Ways and Means budget. So top 5 things to know. Early education spending in total in the House Ways and Means FY 2026 proposal equals about $1.67 billion, which is roughly 8% higher than the final budget for FY 2025, but it is slightly lower than the governor's total funding for EDC, which I'll show on the next slide as well. As Megan mentioned, C3 is level funded in the House Ways and Means budget at $475 million. Childcare financial assistance receives $965.8 million in the House Ways and Means budget, as well as an additional $53 million to support current capacity levels, current rate annualization, which is lower than the governor's proposal for FY 2026 for CCFA. So I will get into that also in a little bit. In addition, the House Ways and Means budget includes a couple proposals to lower the income eligible wait list and, like we mentioned in the supplemental budget, increase rates for FY 26. CPPI is funded at $10 million. Notably, this funding level is lower than the FY 2025 GAA and lower than the governor's budget proposal for FY 26. Between the operating budget for FY 26 and the innovation and capital supplemental budget, the House also includes some additional workforce support funding that was not included in the governor's proposal. So we'll walk through each of these pieces next. Before we get there, though, we just like to show kind of a historic chart showing the funding increases for EEC since fiscal year 2020. Between FY 2020 and FY 2025, funding for the department grew by $855 million. Historic investments in C3 and increases to CCFA and reimbursement rates drove that spending increase, especially during the pandemic as we received additional federal funds, and the state also increased their investment in early education. This chart is hopefully helpful if you want to take a look at the slides later to give an overview of the Ways and Means proposals, House Ways and Means proposals compared to the governor's proposal for FY 26 and compared to last year's final budget. Just wanted to highlight one specific thing here that we don't have a slide later on, but the line item funding for the department's administration, for EEC's administration, did see a decrease of about $1.9 million in their administration line item, which I know is something that the commissioner mentioned on the 9:30 call last week. So we'll see an amendment about that later on, but we'll dig into C3, CCFA, and a couple of these other pieces coming up. Just wanted to also talk about, as Megan mentioned, the kind of funding sources used for early education. So we've seen the past couple years and continuing this year, the surtax being used more and more to support early education programs, especially C3. The House uses $360 million of fair share funds to support the cost of C3 in FY 2026, as well as those supports for CCFA that we mentioned. The House also is proposing to use the remainder of $17 million that is currently in the Early Education High Quality and Affordability Trust Fund to support the Children's Trust at Risk Newborns program. And then they are also proposing, like the governor, using $115 million from the Operational Grant Trust Fund to support C3 as well. Now, going into specific program funding breakdowns. So C3, as I'm sure many folks on this call know, is the state grant program for early education providers. And it was originally a federal program created in 2021, originally fully funded with ARPA funds during the pandemic. And since federal funding expired, Massachusetts has taken up the funding of C3 fully with state resources, and we're the only state to be able to fully continue our pandemic era operational grant program. So you can also see, like I mentioned, that the surtax, that kind of middle-ish blue color, has been increasingly a larger share of the funding for C3 over the past 3 budgets. So House Ways and Means funds C3 again level at $475 million, using $115 million from the Operational Grant Trust Fund and $360 million from the surtax. They also did include an outside section which updated one of the policy proposals included in last year's budget, which stated that large center-based for-profit providers who operate more than 10 centers in the state could not receive more than 1% of total C3 grant funding. The outside section included in this House Ways and Means proposal would increase that to 1.25%. So that's something to watch as well. And then just wanted to also highlight, again, the use of the Operational Grant Trust Fund in FY 2026. Right now, there's enough funds to cover that proposal, but something that we'll be looking as we get into FY 2026 is online lottery revenue, as that program is being implemented by the state. When the Operational Grant Trust Fund was created last year, online lottery was created to fund that trust fund to support C3. So something that we'll be watching is how online lottery gets implemented and the amount of revenue that we are expecting to be collected through that in the coming years. So childcare financial assistance is pretty complicated in the House Ways and Means budget. So I'm going to try to go through it in a couple different pieces. Feel free to put questions in the chat, and I think we should have time to get to them in the end. But the House Ways and Means budget includes at base funding for DCF DTA, CCFA $448.2 million, and for income eligible CCFA $517.6 million. So this first kind of funding proposal is even with the governor bringing the funding for CCFA in their main 2 line items to $965.8 million, which is almost a $200 million increase over the FY 2025 level. However, where we see a difference that we are keeping an eye on as this moves towards the Senate especially, is that in the governor's budget, she proposed an additional $98 million from surtax to support ongoing CCFA capacity, current caseloads, and the annualization of rate increases that were passed in the past 2 budgets. So the governor proposed $98 million for this capacity and maintenance piece for CCFA. In the House Ways and Means budget, we saw $53 million proposed for this capacity and maintenance piece. So that's $45 million gap between that kind of maintenance level funding. And in addition to that, the House also included some funding to support an added caseload through the reduction of the income eligible wait list, $15 million for that. And like I mentioned in the supplemental budget, they included $20 million, a $20 million earmark to support increased rates in FY 2026. So the reason why we wanted to spend a little bit of time here is because the different funding proposals that House is putting forward in their House Ways and Means budget, it's unclear whether that would be enough to support even just current caseload and the annualization of current reimbursement rates. So while they're including funding with the intention to expand access and rates through the reduction of the income eligible wait list, the funding proposed overall does not appear sufficient to cover current caseload projections. And this chart here just shows kind of the most recent numbers from EEC on the wait list for income eligible care. We know that EEC is also continuing a process to implement policy changes that were passed in last year's budget to expand income eligible CCFA eligibility to up to 85% SMI, which we would only anticipate would increase the demand for assistance as well. So a couple pieces to track there. On CPPI, the House Ways and Means budget funds the program at $10 million. This is a $7.5 million decrease compared to the current funding level for CPPI, and a $7.7 million decrease compared to the governor's proposal in her operating budget. As I noted earlier, the governor also proposed an additional $50 million to expand CPPI to all gateway cities by the end of FY 2026, and the House did not include this additional funding in their supplemental budget. For Head Start, the House Ways and Means budget allocates $18.5 million for state supplemental grants for Head Start programs, which is level with the governor's proposal for FY 26 and with FY 2025 levels. Naturally, this is something that's on a lot of folks' minds as we are still, feeling a lot of uncertainty and concern from the federal side of Head Start funding. Head Start receives these state supplemental grants through the budget, but it's largely a federally funded program, federally managed, and we're continuing to track kind of what we hear from the federal level that could potentially impact Massachusetts childcare providers and Head Start providers as the federal budget process continues. But we definitely encourage folks, if you are curious for the most up-to-date information, to reach out to the Massachusetts Head Start Association for that. And then lastly on this section, I just wanted to highlight some workforce support proposals included in the House Ways and Means budget. One is $5 million for career pathways, which is level with the governor's proposal. And then the House also included several proposals that were not included in the governor's budget for FY 26, including $7.5 million to continue early educator scholarships. And then, like I mentioned, the supplemental budget also includes $7.5 million for a loan forgiveness program and $8 million for early educator personal child care. So what comes next? Like I said, we are tracking amendments. Debate will happen next week. So just wanted to highlight a few ones we caught. So Rep. Worrell filed an amendment to increase the state Head Start grant appropriation to $20 million. Rep. O'Day filed an amendment which would add a $450,000 earmark to support Jumpstart within the EEC administration line item. Rep. Sabadosa filed a amendment to increase CPPI funding to $17.7 million, level with last year's budget, or level with the governor's proposal. And then Rep. Peisch also filed an amendment to increase the department administration line item by $1.9 million so that it could level the personnel at the department. And like I mentioned, these amendments will be grouped into these bigger consolidated amendment packages. So all education amendments and local aid amendments are usually grouped together during debate and voting. And then after the House finalizes their budget proposal next week, we will turn our attention to the Senate as they both put out their proposal for the Innovation Capital Fund supplemental budget and their FY 2026 operating budget. And then through June, we will be looking at the conference committee process where the House and Senate will come together and reconcile any differences between their proposals. And Megan, just a few slides on the federal impact we're tracking.
Sure. So as I've mentioned a couple times, and Victoria's mentioned too throughout the presentation, I think one of the things that we're continuing to try to wrap our hands around is just how we can kind of most effectively track and understand what the state impacts are of federal actions and their potential impacts on both the larger economy and directly to Massachusetts. We recently put out a report last week trying to outline kind of the reasons why we think Massachusetts should be prepared and just put in that report a couple of kind of key things to pay attention to as we try to untangle just what each action could potentially mean for the state budget, but also state policy and the people who live here more generally. So one of the things that we highlight in that report are that there are really kind of three reasons why we think Massachusetts should be prepared to mitigate the impacts of potential federal actions and what those reasons are. So the first thing that we talk about is that there are just kind of ideological reasons why Massachusetts needs to be prepared for impacts of federal action. I think we've already seen that the administration has been willing to kind of actively use executive authority to make pretty expansive changes to existing programs or agency operations related to immigration, equity, diversion, or gender affirming services, among many others. But there are just kind of these ideological differences between kind of the current administration and Massachusetts and the policies we have in place here that could make us maybe more of a target for federal action. There are also some practical reasons why we need to be prepared. So tax reform, for one, is a major priority for the Republican-led Congress, and paying for the expansion or extension of a tax reform package would likely mean a negative impact on federal assistance to states and municipalities. And then lastly, there are kind of process reasons why we need to be prepared for federal action and its impacts. I think one of the things that has been really clear over, the past few months and especially the past few weeks is that there's just kind of a lack of clarity and understanding around what each independent executive action or delay might mean or what the resulting legal challenges could mean. And just those uncertainties of things related to tariffs or trade or immigration policy, they can really hinder public action or private section action and investments, and just kind of paralyze decision makers in some cases on how to respond. So generally, these are kind of the three bullet points that we outlined in that report for why we need to be prepared and kind of proactive about understanding what the impacts of federal action could be. And then the last thing that we don't highlight in the report that came out last week, but we have another report coming out maybe the end of this week or early next week that kind of walks through the federal budget process. Because in addition to those three factors on the earlier slide that I just walked through, I think one of the things that we know is going to have really one of the largest impacts on the state budget is what's included in the federal budget. And specifically, what are those proposals going to look like to expand or extend tax reform? And what are the reductions in services or cuts to programs that are going to be targeted to offset the costs of those expansions or extensions. And so it was helpful for us to put together this slide deck, and this one slide is included in it to kind of walk through that process because it is pretty different from the normal state budget process that we're used to tracking. So theoretically, the timeline for federal budget action is that the president will submit their budget in early February. The House and the Senate then adopt separate budget resolutions that set spending and revenue targets for the coming year. And then the House and Senate agree on a joint budget resolution. Independently, then, the House and the Senate act on up to 12 separate appropriations bills that get organized by subcommittee, with the goal of having the president sign the final federal budget by October 1st. So the way that we've been kind of understanding this is that we are thinking that there's going to be a lot more information about what's included in the federal budget and how it impacts Massachusetts closer towards the beginning of our new fiscal year FY26 in July. But this process is often delayed, and so we could be kind of in a bit of a holding pattern as they move through this process. Although, as we've all kind of already seen, we hear kind of snippets of things that could potentially be included in this budget, and we try to assess those as they come as well.
All right, so that's all we have. I'm going to stop sharing our screen here and we can take a look at the chat. Feel free to raise your hand also if you want to ask any questions. Let's see. So from Tom, in addition to federal uncertainty, is it also true that state revenue collections generally lag behind broader economic slowdowns? That's a great question. I don't know, Megan, if you want to start on that one.
Sure. Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And I should have mentioned that. So when we talk about kind of revenue collections in FY25, still looking somewhat positive, what we need to be mindful of is, of course, the impacts of federal action, but also that changes in broader economic trends, uh, they will impact state tax revenue collections, but those impacts can often lag behind what we're kind of seeing at a broader level. And so that's really helpful to keep in mind. So we aren't too optimistic about how well things are going in Massachusetts if things look to be trending in a different direction kind of nationally.
And then I also see a question on the CPPI funding in the House Ways and Means budget. So yeah, like we said, that's kind of one of the major differences between the House and governor's proposals for FY26. And I think there's probably a couple factors there. I think you know, this budget cycle and the fact that we have both an operating budget and a supplemental budget moving does make like seeing the total funding for programs a little more complicated. And so that there could have been, I think we've heard there might have been some confusion about what funding levels for CPPI continuation would be. And then also I think something that we think about as well is that historically, I think CPPI has been also a Senate priority as well. So we could definitely see a higher funding level when the Senate releases their budget. I don't know, Megan, if you have any other thoughts on the CPPI funding decrease.
No, I think both of those points are exactly right. And just to draw back to kind of a larger point on the House Ways and Means budget is that it did spend about $600 million less than the governor's proposal. And those cuts were kind of felt across the range of state departments and agencies. But certainly this could kind of be seen as a part of that overall effort to reduce total spending levels as well.
I see a couple questions on kind of the impact of that post funding for early educator personal childcare on the wait list. I think that's a great question. I think that in general, there's a lot of process that goes along with the administration of CCFA and the prioritization of folks on the wait list. So I think that, if the $8 million for early educator personal childcare goes through in the final budget, that's definitely something that would impact the wait list, but also unclear with the regulation changes and other policy changes that EEC is trying to implement, kind of what the steps there will be in opening up the wait list if there is funding for that. And the process that allows some programs to have, okay, so Melora is asking about the process that allows programs to have non-discretionary spending increases year over year versus level spending levels. And especially around Chapter 70, how that kind of works versus the way that C3 is being funded.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. So I should say that on the slide where we divide programs between kind of non-discretionary versus discretionary programs, that's a designation that we have identified kind of separately. I think it largely aligns with how the administration or the legislature would think about certain programs compared to others, but there could be a few differences. I think the difference between a program like Chapter 70, when we talk about that related to, for example, income eligible childcare as being more of a discretionary program. Chapter 70 in the Student Opportunity Act specifically kind of laid out this implementation schedule to systematically increase the education finance formula to direct additional aid to school districts and to students. And so we think of that as a non-discretionary program because it was a law that was signed into effect in 2019, and the state has kind of committed to meeting that implementation schedule. And just generally kind of direct aid to cities and towns tends to be thought of as more non-discretionary versus discretionary. That being said, a lot of programs that we talk about as being discretionary, like income eligible childcare, like those are very important programs, and they're not easy cuts to make. It's not as though they're like easy programs to not fund at the level that's required. That being said, because they're subject to appropriation, I think they can sometimes be seen as like having a little bit more flexibility as opposed to a program where the state is obligated to continue covering those costs.
And I would also add, especially on C3, I think there is a factor that it is a relatively newer program that the state is funding. And in general, a lot of state programs are just level funded year after year. And then another example that came to my mind is funding for the CCRNRs, which has been also level funded the past few years. So very common there, but something that they debate each year, I think. And then another question from Lydia in the chat. Any context for the increase in the DCF DTA line item compared to last year? Yeah, that's a great question. I think as Megan mentioned, that's one of the kind of mandatory non-discretionary programs that we see in the state budget. And in general, I think DCF and DTA have seen their caseloads increase, and the child care financial assistance for those families is a mandatory program. So the state is mandated to be able to provide assistance to those families coming in through DCF and DTA. So as more families are receiving assistance from those departments and looking for childcare, I think that's why we see that kind of increased funding level for that program, so that the state is able to maintain that commitment going forward. And it's $200 million. So I don't know, Megan, if you want to talk about maybe generally how different funding asks are prioritized and how that process works from inside the building, if there's any insights on that.
Sure. Yeah. So I cannot speak specifically to the kind of decision-making process that took place at House Ways and Means. I can kind of speak to my experience from when I worked at Senate Ways and Means on how you intake all of these requests and then try to put forward a budget that's balanced and kind of takes into consideration a number of other factors. A lot of the times, we're working within pretty constrained resources and need to meet a lot of priorities. And so that's going to be kind of the overarching lever that people are looking at when deciding which requests to fund and which not to fund. And sometimes I think it can just be a challenge. There's limited dollars in a lot of really important programs. And so when deciding which programs receive increased funding compared to the prior fiscal year, I think you see increases for those non-discretionary programs that we have been talking about. Whereas other programs, tend not to see their full request fulfilled. But we can't kind of speak specifically to the decision-making process at House Ways and Means on that one.
Thank you, Megan. And then I think it's time for one last question. It is 11 o'clock, but thank you all for coming. But just again on kind of the process that we'll be watching for CCFA funding. I think as EEC is seeing the funding levels proposed, to maintain current capacity, it's unclear whether they will be able to reopen access for income eligible childcare. And if there is additional funding made, I think that the second question is then, what is the prioritization, on the wait list, and how are kind of different families facing that kind of long wait, who have already been eligible. How does that kind of work with new families who will become eligible soon? And I know that EC is currently accepting, public comment concerning their implementation of those new policies. So just wanted to highlight that. But thank you all so much for joining us today. Feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions as the process continues. And just wanted to say thank you again for joining us today. Have a great rest of your week.